Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and today I'm talking about Star Wars. Specifically, I'm asking the question that nerds have been arguing over since the beginning of time. Is Star Wars science fiction or not? Now, the easy answer is obviously yes, because space and spaceships and robots and space travel and laser swords and technology and holograms and blah 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 blah. That's the obvious answer. Yeah, okay, sure. But the more nuanced answer, nerds will put their finger up and go, technically, it's science fantasy. Um, of course, they have to ignore episode 1 and the existence of midichlorians to come to that conclusion, which they will tie themselves up in knots to ignore episode 1 while still acknowledging episode 3 for some reason. But let's put that aside for a second. Let's just take it piece by piece. What is science fiction? Now, I've heard Star Wars called space opera. But there's no fucking singing in Star Wars. There's no musical numbers. There's no fat lady. There's no Vikings. So, fuck that. It's not a fucking opera at all. Whoever calls it a space opera is a dipshit. And I'm gonna die on that hill. So, let's just throw that vocabulary out of our mouths. Let's just get that out of our dictionary. That is bullshit. We're not even going to use that terminology. A lot of times people will compare it to Star Trek and they'll say science fiction is hopeful and Star Wars isn't hopeful. Although I would argue actually Star Wars is hopeful. Or they would say science fiction is aspirational and Star Wars is not aspirational because it's set in the past, in a fictional past. But that doesn't mean it can't be aspirational. We can't, aspire to invent, holocron technology or lightsaber technology or droid technology or hyperspace technology or even, repulsor lift technology. There's technology, science fiction technology, busting out the seams in Star Wars. And as far as the technology goes, I've seen the documentary, the Discovery Channel documentary on the science of Star Wars. And according to the scientists who analyzed Star Wars, the science checks out. It's plausible. It's not currently possible with our existing understanding, but with what we do know, there is a plausible pathway to the technology in Star Wars if certain assumptions we make about the universe pan out and become true. Just like we can say with Star Trek. Same thing. We don't have warp space in like they do in Star Trek, so we don't have hyperspace either, but we don't know which technology is actually feasible because we don't currently have either technology. However, there's a monkey wrench in all of this. We're talking technology, space travel, etc. What about the Force? So, Star Wars nerds are quick to point out there's mysticism in Star Wars. And because mysticism exists in Star Wars, you have psychic powers. You have wizards with psychic powers. And because of that, Star Wars is by default swords and sorcery, which makes it fantasy, space fantasy, or science fantasy. Except, I've seen Star Trek. There is psychic stuff in Spock does a psychic mind meld with Bones in Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, and when Spock's body is resurrected in The Search for Spock by the Genesis machine, Bones transfers psychically, magically, transfers Spock's soul from his brain into the reincarnated Spock body, giving us reincarnated Spock. Why is that not considered fantasy, but Star Wars is? Star Trek nerds and Star Wars snobs can't give me an answer on that. And so I'm just going to say, fuck that. If Star Trek is sci-fi and Star Trek has fucking goddamn psychics in it, and by the way, there's other psychics in Star Trek. The Next Generation has a literal psychic on the crew. If Star Trek is classified as science fiction and Star Trek has psychic wizards, why can't Star Wars also be considered Star Trek, or science fiction, when it has psychic wizards? So either Star Wars is science fiction because Star Trek is, or if Star Wars is space fantasy, so is fucking Star Trek. You see where I'm going with this? You gotta pick a lane and stay in it. You can't zigzag. I'm gonna go with, yes, Star Trek is absolutely science fiction because it's fiction. It's make-believe. Make-believe can have unbelievable, supernatural, fantastical, unexplainable elements. So can sci-fi. So can Star Wars. Just because it has the, quote, Force doesn't make it fantasy. Also, let's talk about the Force. What is the Force? The Force is... We're just going to talk about the original trilogy for the purists. The Force is an energy field that surrounds and creates life, or is created by life. It surrounds life. It binds life together and penetrates life. It's an energy field. This is science fiction. Energy. You learn about it in physics class. The Force is a type of energy. Therefore, it is not magic. It is science. However, once we bring in the prequel trilogy and introduce midichlorians, we learn a little bit more about the Force. Now we realize that there are microscopic bacteria living inside sentient living creatures who are able to communicate with the Force in a symbiotic relationship. Again, science, not magic. The Force is not magic. So even if we don't talk about episode 1, the Force is still science. There's no magic in the Force. It isn't magic. It's not a magical energy field. It's a scientifically measurable energy field. In the Star Wars expanded universe, the Legends Legacy expanded universe that is no longer canon, the Empire had machines that could scan a person's DNA and determine if they had a connection to the Force or not. This is science. A machine, a computer technology, microchip machine could not measure the existence of, quote, the Force if the Force was magic. The Force is not magic. It is science. Therefore, Star Wars is science fiction. It is not science fantasy. There is no fantasy in Star Wars. Get over it. Stop with this nonsense. And for the love of God, do not ever say space opera in my presence.